Well, hello everybody. I hope you're enjoying your snow day. It is Tuesday, and because we've had two snow days in a row and you have a test coming up tomorrow, I have decided to pre-record chapters 16 and 17. So your assignment, your independent classwork right now is to listen to me read chapters 16 and 17 and discuss them so that on Thursday we can read chapters 18 and 19 and finish the book and be ready to go for our film study on Friday. You remember the big climax from chapters 14 and 15 was the hurricane and Timothy's death. Now we open up with chapter 16, where Philip is realizing his worst fear, which is he is alone on the island. He's not entirely alone, he's got Stu Cat, but you'll notice just like Timothy did when they first got on the K, Philip is reviewing his priorities. What does he need to do to survive now that Timothy is gone? And I want you to pay attention to all the things that Philip has to do now by himself and blind, those things that Timothy was able to do himself having sight. Now Philip has to do these things on his own. Okay, let's read. Chapter 16. In the afternoon, I groped west along the hill. So this is the afternoon after Timothy has died. 30 or 40 feet from the last palm tree, I began to dig a grave for Timothy. I cleared palm fronds, chunks of sea grape, pieces of wood, dead fish, fan coral, and shells that the sea had thrown up. I marked out a space about 7 feet long and 4 feet wide. Then I dug with my hands. At first I was angry with Timothy. I said to Stu Cat, "Why did he leave us alone here?" Then, as I dug, I had other thoughts. Keep in mind that digging a grave, graves are usually about 6 feet deep and 7 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 6 feet deep. Digging that with your bare hands, that is a lot of exhausting work. With his great back to the storm, taking its full punishment, he had made it possible for me to live. When my grandfather died, my father had said, "Philip, sometimes people die from just being very, very tired." I think that is what happened to Timothy. I also think that had I been able to see, I might not have been able to accept it all. But strangely, the darkness separated me from everything else. It was as if my blindness were protecting me from fear. I buried Timothy, placing stones at the head of the grave to mark it. I didn't know what to say over the grave. I said, "Thank you, Timothy," and then turned my face to the sky. I said, "Take care of him, God. He was good to me." Whenever you say words for a person at their funeral, that's called a eulogy. It's usually a short speech given in honor of the person. So this is Philip's eulogy to Timothy. There didn't seem to be anything else to say, so I just stood by his grave for a while. Then I felt my way back to the spot where our hut had been. I located wood and piled it around the base of the palm tree that held our water keg and the tin box. Remember, Timothy had lashed it high up on the palm tree. Both were to the lee side of the storm. It took me a long time to get the keg and the tin box to the ground, but I found, on opening the bung, that the water was still sweet and that the matches, wrapped in cellophane inside the tin box, were dry. But the two small bars of chocolate that we had been saving for a feast were ruined. I had no taste for them anyway. Feeling it everywhere under my feet, I knew that the K was littered with debris. And of course, debris is the leftover remains of something. Sometimes people call it garbage, but it can just be anything that's left behind and salvageable. I started cleaning the camp area, or what was left of it. I piled all the palm fronds, frayed by the wind, in one place, sticks of wet driftwood in another. With Stu Cat constantly around, I stumbled over him several times. I worked until I felt it was nearing darkness. I'd found one lone coconut in a mass of sea grape and broken sticks. I opened it and ate the meat, offering to share with Stu Cat, who didn't seem interested. Then I made a bed of palm fronds and sprawled out on it, listening to the still angry sea as it tumbled around the damp quay and thinking, I must feed myself and Stu Cat. I must rebuild the hut and build another signal fire down on East Beach. Then I must spend each day listening for the sound of aircraft. I knew Timothy had already given up on any schooner entering the dangerous Devil's Mouth. I was certain that the sea had washed away Timothy's markers atop the coral reef, and I was also sure that my guide vine rope leading down to the beach had been snapped and tangled by the storm. But now, for the first time, I fully understood why Timothy had so carefully trained me to move around the island and the reef. The reef, I thought. How could I fish without any poles? They must have been washed away. Then I remembered Timothy saying that he would put them in a safe place. The trouble was, he'd forgotten to tell me where. I got up and began to run my hands over each palm trunk. On one of them, I touched rope. I followed it around to the lee side with my fingers, and there they were, not 2 or 3, but at least a dozen, lashed together, each with a barbed hook and bolt sinker. They were one more part of the legacy Timothy had left me. Okay, let's first look at this vocabulary word, legacy. The legacy that Timothy had left me is what Philip said. Legacy is something transmitted by or received from an ancestor or predecessor or from the past. So it's a piece of knowledge or wisdom that has been passed down from somebody. And of course, Timothy not only taught Philip how to fish, but he had enough foresight to be prepared in case something happened, to make new fish poles and tie them to the tree for Philip to find. Let's look at our notes here. We see Philip dug a grave for Timothy and gave his small eulogy. There's the word eulogy. And this line here, but now for the first time, I fully understood why Timothy had so carefully trained me to move around the island and the reef. What is Philip realizing? Well, Timothy prepared Philip to be independent. Draw conclusions. Timothy knew that Philip may be forced to survive on his own, right? He saw that as a possibility. And of course, we know that he left those fishing poles for him. Now we find that Philip is considering his priorities. This is the next morning after the storm. The sun came out strong in the morning. I could feel it on my face. It began to dry the island, and toward noon, I heard the first cry of a bird. They were returning. Remember, the birds leave when a storm comes and they come back after when it's safe. By now, I had taught myself to tell time, very roughly, simply by turning my head toward the direct warmth of the sun. If the angle was almost overhead, I knew it was around noon. If it was low, then of course it was early morning or late evening. There was so much to do that I hardly knew where to start. Get a campfire going, pile new wood for a signal fire, make another rain catchment for the water keg, weave a mat of palm fibers to sleep on, then make a shelter of some kind, fish the hole on the reef, inspect the palm trees to see if any coconuts were left. I didn't think any could be up there, and search the whole island to discover what the storm had deposited. It was enough work for weeks, and I said to Stu Cat, I don't know how we'll get it all done. He has to search the island for anything that was deposited, left behind. But something told me I must stay very busy and not think about myself. And that's an important line. So here are all the things Philip considers as his priorities that he has to do, all the things Timothy taught him to do to survive. And then we have But something told me I must stay very busy and not think about myself. Let's make an inference. What does he mean by that line? Well, the conclusion you can draw, and I'm sure maybe you understand this, maybe you've gone through this, feeling sorry for yourself will only keep you stuck in a situation. Focusing on important tasks helps take your mind off your problems. And that's what Philip is realizing. He's like, I can't just sit here and wallow in what we call self-pity, feeling sorry for myself. He's like, there are things that need to be done. And it's better that I keep busy and keep my mind off the fact that I'm alone here. I accomplished a lot in 3 days, even putting a new edge on Timothy's knife by honing it on coral. I jabbed it into the palm nearest my new shelter so that I would always know where it was if I needed it. Without Timothy's eyes, I was finding that in my world, everything had to be very precise and exact place for everything. And you can see this word here, honing the knife on coral, which means he's sharpening the knife. And everything had to be very precise. Well, the context clue for that is a synonym, exact. Something precise is exact. On the 5th day after the storm, I began to scour the island to find out what had been cast up. Scour meaning to look at every place on the island very, very carefully. It was exciting, and I knew it would take days or weeks to accomplish. I had made another cane, and beginning with East Beach, I felt my way back and forth, reaching down to touch everything that my cane struck, sometimes having to spend a long time trying to decide what it was that I held in my hands. I found several large cans and used one of them to start the time can again, dropping 5 pebbles into it so that the reckoning would begin again from the night of the storm. I discovered an old broom and a small wooden crate that would make a nice stool. I found a piece of canvas and tried to think of ways to make pants from it, but I had no needle or thread. Now's a good time to remind ourselves that the time can, which is starting 5 days after the storm, all we know about the storm is that it was in July. We don't know the date. So we know that Philip and Timothy were on the island for about 48 days in May, and then by July it was 4 months. Now, 5 days after the storm, we don't know exactly what date it is. Other than that, I found many shells, some bodies of dead birds, pieces of cork, and chunks of sponge, but nothing I could really put to good use. It was on the 6th day after the storm, when I was exploring on South Beach, that I heard the birds. Stu Cat was with me, as usual, and he growled when they first screeched. Their cries were angry, and I guessed that 7 or 8 might be in the air. Notice that use of personification there. Their cries were angry. I stood listening to them, wondering what they were. Then I felt a beat of wing past my face and an angry cry as the bird dived at me. Again, there's the personification, an angry cry. I lashed out at it with my cane, wondering why they were attacking me. Now that word, lashed, well, it's a multiple meaning word, and you remember that it means to fasten securely with a rope or chain, right? Timothy lashed the keg and the tin box on the tree, but it can also mean to whip or fling about violently. So Philip has his cane and he's lashing it out at the birds. It can also mean to thrash or beat something violently. And you can even say that somebody who is verbally attacking you is lashing out at you. Another dived down, screaming at me, and his bill nipped the side of my head. So the bill, which is the beak, nipped Philip's head. For a moment, I was confused, not knowing whether to run for cover under sea grape, or what was left of it, or try to fight them off with my cane. There seemed to be a lot of birds. Then one pecked my forehead sharply, near my eyes, and I felt blood run down my face. I started to walk back toward camp, but had taken no more than 3 or 4 steps when I tripped over a log. I fell into the sand, and at the same time felt a sharp pain in the back of my head. I heard a raging screech as the bird soared up again. Then another bird dived at me. So let's take a pause there and sequence of events, which was on your test. One of these questions was about this paragraph. And the phrase at the same time, there's a word for that we learned in the Power of Un, and that word is simultaneously, when things happen at the same time. So when the question on the test asked you what two events happened simultaneously at the same time, it was Philip falling into the sand and the bird pecking him in the back of the head. He feels a sharp pain in the back of his head and a raging screech. So you can infer that as he fell into the sand, a bird was pecking his head simultaneously at the same time. I heard Stu Cat snarling and felt him leap up on my back, his claws digging into my flesh. There was another wild screech, and Stu Cat left my back, leaping into the air. Let's be clear now, because this was another question on the test. Stu Cat is leaping on Philip's back to protect him. His snarls and the wounded screams of the bird filled the stillness over the cave. I could hear them battling in the sand. Then I heard the death call of the bird. Obviously, Stu Cat got that bird to the ground and killed it. I lay still a moment. I crawled to where Stu Cat had his victim. I touched him. His body was rigid, which means stiff, and his hair was still on edge. He was growling, low and muted. Now, I don't know if you guys have a pet that is hunted, but I have a cat or had a cat that used to hunt, and that's what they do. They get into hunter mode, and nothing will faze them, and they get wild, big dilated eyes, and their fur stands on end, and they go, and that's what Stu Cat's doing. Then I touched the bird. It had sounded large, but it was actually rather small. I felt the beak. It was very sharp. Slowly, Stu Cat began to relax. Wondering what had caused the birds to attack me, I felt around in the sand. Soon, my hand touched a warm shell. I couldn't blame the birds very much. I'd accidentally walked into their new nesting ground. So Philip was walking on the nesting ground where they had the eggs of the unborn baby chicks. And Philip, who couldn't see, was accidentally walking on the eggs and breaking them. They were fighting for survival after the storm, just as I was. I left Stu Cat to his unexpected meal and made my way slowly back to camp. You can infer from this line very obviously, Stu Cat ate the bird that he killed. And this line, they were fighting for survival just as I was. Well, there's a theme there. Survival is difficult for any living creature, guys. And young creatures cannot defend themselves from dangers. Sometimes parents must be overprotective so that their children stay alive. Animals and humans will, if necessary, take drastic measures to survive and protect their young. And so Philip is having another transformative moment where he's realizing this lesson of these birds attacked me, and at first he didn't have any idea why, but he realizes that, wow, I'm trying to survive on this island and so are they, and they're just protecting their young. And so here are the notes for that, remembering about the word lash and the sequence of events and the word simultaneously. All right, chapter 17. 10 pebbles had gone into my time can when I decided to do something Timothy had told me never to do. I was tired of eating fish and sea grape leaves, and I wanted to save the few green coconuts I'd managed to find on the ground. There were none left in the trees. I wanted scallops or a langosta to roast over the fire. I didn't dare go out off North Beach for scallops because of the sharks. but I thought there might be a langosta clinging to coral at the bottom of the fishing hole. From what Timothy had told me, the sea entrance to the hole was too narrow for a large fish, a shark, to swim through. Barracuda, he'd said, could go through, but they were not usually dangerous. If there happened to be an octopus down there, it would have to be a very small one. The big ones were always in deep water. So he'd said it was safe for him to dive in the hole. I sharpened a stick the way Timothy had done, but I knew that if I felt a langosta with my left hand, I would have to be very quick with my right hand, or he would use his tail to push away from me across the sand. With Stucat, I went down to the reef and felt my way along it until I found the familiar edges of the hole. I told Stucat, if I'm not out in 20 minutes, you better jump in and get me. The crazy cat rubbed along my leg and purred. Holding the sharpened stick in my right hand, I slipped into the warm water, treading for a moment, waiting to see if anything came up. Then I ducked my head underwater, swam down a few feet, and came up again. I was certain that nothing was in the hole, aside from the usual small fish I yanked out each morning. After a few minutes, I had my courage up and dived to the bottom, holding the sharp stick in my left hand now and using my right hand to feel the coral and the rocks. Coming up now and then for air, I slowly felt my way around the bottom of the small pool, touching sea fans that waved back and forth, feeling the organ pipe coral and the bigger chunks of brain coral. Several times I was startled when seaweed or sea fans would brush against my face and swam quickly to the surface. It must have taken me nearly 30 minutes to decide that I could hunt langosta in the hole. So let's take a quick pause there and just remember to visualize this is the fishing hole. And remember, there is an entrance, a tunnel entrance to the sea, represented by my pen here. And what Philip is saying is that this entrance, Timothy inferred that this entrance was too narrow for something big like a shark to get through. So Philip thinks it's safe to dive in there. Timothy was able to safely dive in there. And Philip eventually is able to go down to the bottom now to look for a langosta to spear. So we have some of our vocabulary words. Earnest means serious in intention, purpose, or effort, showing sincere and intense conviction. So he's diving in seriousness, earnestness. I went straight down, touched the bottom, and then took a few strokes toward the coral sides of the pool. Timothy had said that langosta were always on the bottom, usually over against the rocks and coral. To my amazement, I touched one on the first sweep and drove the sharp stick into him, swimming quickly to the surface. Panting, I shouted to Stucat, "Lobster tonight!" I swam to the edge, pushed the langosta off the stick, caught my breath again, and dived. I dived many times without again touching the hard shell that meant langosta. I began sticking my hands deeper into the shelves and over the ledges near the bottom. I rested a few minutes, then decided I'd make one more dive. I was happy with the lobster that was now on the reef, but it was quite small, barely a meal for Stucat and myself. I dived again, and this time found what seemed to be an opening into a deep hole, or at least the hole went far back. There has to be a big lobster in there, I thought. Up I came again, filled my lungs, and dived immediately. I ran my hand back into the hole, and something grabbed it. Terrified, I put my feet against the rocks to pull away. The pain was severe. Whatever had my wrist had the strength of Timothy's arms. I jerked hard, and whatever it was came out with my arm, its tail smashing against my chest. I kicked and rose to the surface, the thing still in my wrist, its teeth sunk in deep. I'm sure I screamed as I broke water, flailing toward the edge of the hole. Then the thing let loose, and I made it up over the side and out of the hole. Oh, okay. So let's try and visualize what happened. My inference is that Philip put his hand into the hole that was the entrance, and there was something in there, and he could feel its teeth. So something that had teeth bit onto his arm, and it held onto his hand as he swam to the surface, and it didn't let go until he got to the surface. Pain shooting up my entire arm. I lay panting on the edge of the pool and gingerly began to feel my wrist. Gingerly means very carefully, in a careful or cautious manner. Gingerly. It was bleeding, but not badly. But the teeth had sunk in deep. It wasn't a fish because the body felt long and narrow. Some time later, I made an informed guess, we would call that an inference, that it had been a large moray eel. Whatever it was, I never got back into the hole again. Let's take a look at our notes. Chapter 17, I call Diving Blind. It's 10 days after the storm. And here are the sequence of events for Philip diving. And we know that he catches one langosta, but after diving multiple times, he decides to give it one more chance, sticks his hand into the hole, and something bites into it. Now, it says that Philip made an informed guess, which we would call an inference, that the creature that bit him was a moray eel. Well, let's take a look at what a moray eel is. Oh my goodness. Look at the teeth on that thing. Can you imagine those teeth biting into your hand and latching on as you try to swim to the surface? Okay, so if that really was the thing that bit Philip's hand, that is small enough to get through the tunnel entrance. And Philip didn't really think of that because he had his mind on Langosta. And that concludes our pre-recorded lesson for chapters 16 and 17. I want to thank you for taking your personal time and reading along. And now you are ready for chapters 18 and 19, the last two chapters of the book before we do our film study. So I will see you tomorrow morning. Bye.